This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody. Before today's episode, I'd just like to give another shout out to the forthcoming book, the novel Connery by me, which is available for pre-order at Plumeria Books. I will leave a link in the show notes. It's an exciting, funny, very dark book, and I would appreciate it if you could get a copy and let me know what you think. Thank you very much. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be joined once more by a wonderful friend of the podcast, Ian Nathan. Thank you for joining me, Ian.
Always a pleasure, John. You know, we just talk film. I mean, it's kind of when you say, do you want to do a podcast? I think that's just a good chance to have a really long chat with John about film, really indulge myself.
Well, that's the raison d'etre of the whole podcast. It's just having a weekly conversation with some brilliant experts. And you're certainly one of them. We've talked in the past about Spielberg, Tarantino, Clint Eastwood, and today we're talking about Martin Scorsese. And you've written this wonderful, handsome book, Martin Scorsese, the iconic filmmaker and his work. Before we get into the way we're going to structure this today, I did want to say something about the illustrations of this book, because this is beautifully illustrated.
It's an interesting, we discuss, and obviously part of a series, and when we discuss the new subject, the choices, a lot of it's about, not only sort of what the content of the book, we also discuss it in cover terms. And, no offense to all these wonderful directors I write about, they're not necessarily the prettiest people, in terms of, so you either go with that black and white, serious, Scorsese, big brushy eyebrows, staring intently at the camera look.
Finger to chin.
My French edition has gone for. But I think we've liked increasingly with the kind of English language editions to do a kind of mood piece, I suppose you would call it, a mood board of the book that captures the essence, and we go back and forth. But this one I think is particularly successful. It's a sort of homage to Taxi Driver, but also homage to the fact that New York is his city,
central,
to who he is. So capture all that in it. And just to be eye-catching, sometimes this is really simple when you do covers. You need to catch people's eye, and there's a danger sometimes with film books to be a bit kind of dull looking, and hopefully with these you go, oh, that's aesthetically pleasing. The kind of the old book fetish kind of element.
Oh, absolutely! I've got a collection now of Ian Nathan hardbacks on my shelf, and each one it has this beautiful distinctive illustrated style which I really love on the cover. So today we're going to approach Martin Scorsese a little bit differently to how perhaps he is usually spoken about, because we were talking off mic, there are these films which are in the canon, the sort of top 5 that everybody keeps coming back to: Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Goodfellas, etc. But we want to talk about some of his films which are not as discussed, perhaps. So we've each chosen 2, and then we might slide onto others as we go. But I think we should just take turns with this. Do one each,
okay,
and then work our way through them that way. How's that feel?
Sounds good.
So I will give you the first. What's your first film, Ian? What's the first one you'd like to do?
Well, I'll do After Hours first.
Okay.
And as you say, one of the reasons why I thought let's not just do Scorsese's career, because I think you do get trapped in this kind of gravitational pull of his masterpieces, and for good reason. But even when I came to write the book, that felt a kind of a bit of a tall order. How do you go about writing about these films? and that was fine and good, and I think I did a good job. But what really sparked me was when you got hit upon the Scorsese films. I don't you forget about, but you don't think as much about. And the one that really struck me was After Hours. I know it's sort of thought about as a lesser Scorsese. It's one of those kind of quirky ones he did. You go, oh yes, Scorsese did that. But watching it again, I think is really absolutely central to the kind of director he is, the themes he likes, the way he absorbs his own state of mind and his own sort of state of life at that point into the films themselves. I mean, to begin with, it is clearly a New York film. You know, it's set in New York. For those who don't know, it's a kind of, I suppose, a screwball Kafka is how I would describe it. It's a story of this kind of nebbish everyman computer programmer who clearly wants to get laid. You know, basically that's kind of his desire. Like any sort of young man wants to get laid, and he's drifting in nowhere. And he meets Rosanna Arquette in a late night cafe, and she sort of offers him this temptation. They get on very well, have this lovely sort of almost romantic conversation, and she says, well, you know, words to the effect of come and meet me later. Or she gives him the number. And but the thing is, and this is kind of the humor of the piece, is that she lives in Soho, you know.
Mm.
And at that point in New York's history, Soho was it's kind of the Mordor of Manhattan. It was kind of like this dark place that, you know, no one really knew what happened there. I mean, these days it's incredibly upmarket and sort of bijou and full of kind of shishi shops, but it wasn't then. It's the kind of edge of the former meatpacking district. It was all a bit dark and ominous. And the joke was you never went that far south in Manhattan. You know, you lived in peril. And essentially, yeah, there's this kind of aura of Greek myth in the whole thing. This character played by Griffin Dunn kind of takes a cab ride and he enters a kind of underworld of New York, in which he does interact again with Rosanna Arquette, but all these other incredibly weird characters. And he goes on this kind of dark night of the soul through the New York sort of nighttime and lots of misadventures. And really, it's will he escape almost with his life by the end of it? You know, things are so desperate and it has a beautifully sort of ambiguous sense of ending as well. And, you know, what's important to me in terms of understanding the film is first of all it's written by Griffin Dunn, you know, the star, and it was put out there. You know, they never hoped they could get Scorsese, but it was delivered to Scorsese's lawyer on the kind of off chance. The co-producer of the film is Amy Robinson, who was in Mean Streets, so there were sort of contacts with Scorsese. But Griffin Dunn had no kind of, you know, ambition that it would ever kind of be Scorsese. But Scorsese was going through a really hard time in his career. I mean, when you look at Scorsese's career as a whole, it's this kind of, and to this day, a bit like this, it's a real up and down. It's a roller coaster ride, if you want, of success and disaster. He has this incredibly complicated relationship with Hollywood, where he kind of wants to be part of Hollywood and doesn't at the same time. He has these kind of weird passion projects that almost sort of drive him away from his own career, but he can't shake them. All these things that make him who he is. And he'd been going through this turmoil with Last Temptation of Christ. Studios were going to make it. He was just about to shoot, and you know, he had all his locations and everything. And due to a great deal of nervousness around the studio's behalf, plugs were pulled and all those kind of things. So he was in a really low point. And the more you write about and read about Scorsese, you realize how emotional a man he is, how easily depressed he is, how he's a creative, very much, you know, drawn by his own kind of emotions toward what he does. They're very biographical, his films, but not just in terms of locations and details. In terms of just his own emotional makeup, they are biographical, which is what makes them so raw, I think, and intense. And in a sense, the journey that Griffin Dunn's character goes on, this kind of dark night of the soul, becomes a sort of emblem of where Scorsese was. He'd returned from Hollywood to live back in New York. He was living in Soho. There's this great quirky detail that he had 15 video recorders and he was just recording things off of cable television to watch, all these obscure films he could find. And he would There was this internal clicking going on in his apartment as the various video recorders went on and off. But he got this script, and I think it spoke to him about what was going on with his own life and his own creativity. It was a chance to return to first principles. New York, a young male character essentially wanting love and romance and to have sex, basically. And all these other elements appealed to him too. That it was kind of, I suppose you look at it, and it's his most postmodern film. It's got all these kind of layers that aren't very Scorsesean in some ways. You know, he tends to do sort of non-ironic films. What you see is what you get in all their complexity. But here you have Greek myth, you have Kafka, you've got a bodyguard, one nightclub. I'm not really a bodyguard, a sort of doorman at a nightclub who Griffin Dunne encounters, who gives a whole speech drawn from the trial written by Kafka. He just says it out loud. So it openly admits to the fact that it's constantly referencing things. It references the Cold War, but it's got this mad, dark comic vein. And I think, I mean, you can argue and other people can argue, I think it's his most comedic film in structure. I think it's the broadest comedy in terms of, a lot of his films are very funny, but they're not necessarily comedies. And
Mm.
this one very much is, although at times it's almost a horror movie as well. There's a lovely existential dilemma, who is this guy? How will he survive? It becomes his whole life. And there's these kind of ideas of art versus pragmatism. He's a computer programmer who encounters these weird artists. Linda Fiorentino is this kind of sculptress. Everything's about temptation. There is death. And Scorsese directed it in a kind of, I would say, a sort of a mild state of appropriate hysteria. There's fantastic stories about.
What a brilliant phrase. A
Yeah,
mild case of appropriate hysteria.
well, it's exactly that he directed it with exactly the tone of the film has. And he had all these sort of tricks that he did to kind of create this frenzy that was sort of his sensibility of After Hours. Like he would have the sort of prop department make him sort of glass boxes or glass tubes, vases, just these glass, and you have a brick nearby. And as the middle of the scene, Griffin Dunne would be getting into his flow, and Scorsese would just shatter this glass box, and everyone would just kind of go up. And he never knew when he was going to do it next. So they were always a little bit like, when is he going to do it?
That,
And
that's
there's a
almost
whole
like
thing,
a
the great,
William Friedkin sort of. That's
it's a William Friedkin,
something
yeah,
William
absolutely.
Friedkin would do rather than Martin Scorsese.
Yeah. If you want real fear, really frighten people. It's
Yeah.
that kind of absolute. But I think he wanted everything completely sort of strung out. The whole production needed to be strung out. There's a great story Griffin Dunne tells of one scene where, to warm up for the scene, because it's a scene where he runs into it, instead of just sort of hanging out off set, he goes for a run around the block and enters a bar nearby in sort of darkest Soho in New York in the sort of mid 80s, and goes, "Hi, I'm from the local production, Hollywood," and goes, "I'm going to buy everybody a drink." And of course, it's cheering and they all start ordering. At which point, Dunn runs out again without paying, back to the set and straight into the scene. And I think the production had to send someone, some poor old PA had to be sent down to pay the bill. But you've got this kind of sense, of absolute Scorsese making it at an absolute sense of sort of fever pitch. The scene with John Hurd as the barkeeper. He's trying to get the keys off him to go to his apartment. Very complicated, almost farcical reasons. He needs to go to John Hurd's apartment with his keys, and it's all getting very anxious. And Hurd is just kind of improvising. And Griffin Dunne does his bit, and he's waiting the kind of cut, from Scorsese, and it just doesn't come. And yeah, and so he just keeps staging. Can't break character. You can't break character. And Hurd is starting to go a bit mad. He's kicking tills and he's banging on the bar and he's having a bit of a fit. And Griffin Dunne is still waiting. And this scene just drags on and on and on until finally Scorsese goes, "I'm not going to call cut until I believe you want those keys. You really want those keys." And you realize, God, it must have been an absolute nightmare, but brilliant to make. And I love that idea of Scorsese just living the film, he's living the sensibility of this film. It had to be kind of what he was doing and making it, and probably not a way none of his other films might be. If you're making Goodfellas, you're not going out whacking people, to get into. You're just making the film, which has lots of kind of connection with the material. But After Hours is almost kind of neat Scorsese. There's no sort of mediating mixer. There's no thing that kind of holds it back. It's just him in New York, nighttime, and this kind of incredible, dark, comedic, journey into the soul.
Straight no chaser, Scorsese.
Straight no chaser, absolutely.
I'd want to ask a couple of questions about this film, having seen it quite recently, but still, there was a couple of things uh, talking about it with you reminded me of. One is that scene where Griffin Dunn towards the end becomes sort of encased in he has to hide, so he's
Yeah,
sculpted essentially, or he's papier-mâchéed over.
yeah,
Reminded me so much of Brazil and Robert De
yeah,
Niro's character being smothered by newspaper and then just disappearing. And so there were these intertextual or references, and from the other direction, when I was watching it, I was thinking, I wonder how much Kubrick was influenced by this when he was making Eyes Wide Shut, because it's, from a narrative point of view, it's the same thing. A man
yeah,
abroad in New York, endlessly being, deferring or
yeah,
frustrating sexual energy, and you're kind of wondering, does he really want to have sex? Is he being frustrated so much, or is he himself kind of self-sabotaging the possibilities of
yeah,
having sex? So, like, Tom Cruise turns up at an orgy and is
yeah.
literally a guy who can't get laid at an orgy. I mean, I mean,
But
they
also,
even say to him at one point, "Take your clothes off," and he's like, "Oh no, I didn't think there'd be that. I didn't think there'd be nudity."
there probably is a whole subgenre. I'm sure Scorsese could speak well to this of men who can't get laid comedies, and the kind of source of them. I mean, it all goes back to Carry On films, which are all about men who can't get laid, that kind of weird British way. Um, yeah, absolutely, there is a kind of idea of sexual. There's a myth around it, and I don't know how true this is, that Griffin Dunn was forbidden from having sex in the lead up to the film and during production. That you can't, and so he would always be full of this kind of like frustration.
It's like Raging Bull. It's like Jake
Yeah,
LaMotta before the fight.
yeah,
You've got to be so
yeah.
angry that you'll go and pummel the other guy.
And I also kind of, there's a kind of, there is a marriage between sort of sexual expression and creative expression that's kind of very human. And I think Scorsese sort of tying the two things together, that he was incredibly frustrated that he couldn't make the films he wanted to make in Hollywood. And there's a kind of that kind of sexual, almost became, he's the man who needs to get laid creatively in terms of I just have to go out on this night and make After Hours simply to try and get laid. Those things are kind of aligned. But you're saying about the ending and well, the scene where he gets encased in, he gets hidden from the mob. Basically, the mob in kind of Greek style, the mob come chasing for Griffin Dunn's character, and to hide him, he gets wrapped up in this kind of paper mache. And there was an original ending in which the van would just drive off, with him still encased in kind of this sculpture and forever. Lost, you don't know what became of him. But obviously, studio and financial backers decided they needed a clearer ending. But you get the sense of Scorsese enjoying the metaphorical side of these things. It's like it's a man encased in art. He's trapped in
Mm,
art, and
mm.
that's almost was Scorsese's problem. He was entrapped in the films he had to make, and here was a film where he was breaking free of the papier mâché. He was breaking free and sort of breathing again because there weren't these expectations. There weren't his self-imposed kind of artistic ambitions. It was just one quick sort of throwaway film. But of course, Scorsese never makes throwaway films. They're always imbued with so much of who he is. But I do get this. It was a kind of a great release, this film. Ironically enough, though, it's about a man who can't have any release and that just ends up running for his life. But yeah, it's got a kind of farcical energy that's very tied up with his libido as a
That's
character.
That's great. And the other question I wanted to ask was, you were talking about how emotional Scorsese is, and I found that to be one of the revelations of Rebecca Miller's new documentary, Mr. Scorsese. Was this, you don't necessarily get exactly a warts and all version of him. I think there's a sense that he is, to some degree, some of the rough edges are smoothed over, but
Yeah,
there is a sense that he is smashing telephones and throwing things out of the window.
yeah.
And I mean, it is treated like a joke. And I do find, and there is something, just absurd about it. But there's also something like, okay, if we called it Scott Rudin and he was doing the same thing, you would be going, what an absolute monster. Fancy being that guy's, having to work for that guy.
Yeah.
But because it's Scorsese, it's like, oh yeah, but there are so many good clips of him on YouTube, so we'll forgive him anything, So I was, what did you make of that documentary?
I haven't seen it all.
Right.
Yeah, I do. The danger of, and I'm sure you experience this, is when you immerse yourself in the world of something, you hear all these stories, and in a sense, once you've been out the other end, you kind of resist it a bit and go, "Oh, I
Mm,
don't need to hear another Scorsese story for at least, 2 years." But yeah, I have got into it, and yeah, I do get a sense that they are mollifying something of him. One thing I think, having made a couple of documentaries now, and one thing I'm really interested in, and about all, in terms of filmmaking, is it's really hard, to write or to make a documentary about the actual process of filmmaking. You can tell a lot of
mm,
stories about how a project comes together. You can write a lot about how a film is received, but the bit in between is the really hard bit to kind of express. Partly because these films take forever to make. Even something as quick as After Hours is probably 8 weeks of shooting and post-production, and there's a daily grind involved in that. That's really hard to kind of get across. And I do feel that what you kind of miss, and because it's doing the whole career that Rebecca Miller's sort of series sort of misses it a bit, is what is it like to be on set with Scorsese? What is it like to be directed by Scorsese? What is it like? Can you see the genius in the moment? What was it like? When he on Goodfellas, we're going to come to Goodfellas because you always draw back to them. When he worked out the route of the famous tracking shot, into the copper, that Scorsese did it. He walked them through it, and he said, "Right, you to there, you look to the left. We go around, we spin back around the kitchen so we can go twice the length." What is that like to see him figure it out in
mm.
person in the moment? And I don't know if it quite captures that. It sort of captures the myth, but I'm very interested in how the brushstrokes go down, and what makes Scorsese Scorsese in terms of what does he say to the actors? How does he draw out? Well, how do him and De Niro communicate? I think by all accounts they don't really communicate on set. It's more like a form of telepathy. But what is going on, especially with films, the big films like Taxi Driver and Goodfellas? you know, I'm kind of interested in the creative process as a whole. When I watch, what I liked about Peter Jackson's Beatles documentary, as long, inordinately long as it is, Get Back, is actually finally we got kind of into the creative process, how the Beatles made Beatles songs, how they came to life. We knew all about Yoko and the myths and what falling out and all the history. But suddenly I was like, well, so that's how it works. And there's a bit of trial and error. There's them getting it wrong. I thought, God, this is fascinating.
Yeah, totally.
Genius doesn't necessarily come fully formed.
I totally agree. And I mean, I'd love to see a film documentary. I mean, I haven't seen it yet. Maybe Mike Figgis's Megadoc does this, but it would be
Yeah,
great to have almost like a real-time documentary where you see a shot or a scene filmed over and over again,
yeah,
or not even over and over again, the one or two times, and what it takes to set it up and what it takes. And
yeah,
you see as you say, you see the actors walking away and just trying to stay in the moment and be in their own heads, and then going back to the scene, and then maybe follow that scene through editing and for until it's almost like a slow cinema version where you just get
yeah,
interested in the process of it and you forget the personalities and the talking heads and all the rest of it, and you just see the
yeah,
craft. where do they put the lights, and why does it take so long to set up a shot? What's people are always saying it takes us about an hour to set up this shot. Well, what are you doing for that hour? I kind of interested. People are
Yeah.
laying down tracks, and you know uh, I'm such an
Yeah.
impatient person, and because I'm a writer, I'm sure you'll feel this as well. In fact, I'm interested having done both. Is one of the things that really attracts me about being a writer. Is that if I decide that's not working, then delete, 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 and off I go again. And it
Yeah.
doesn't take me any. I don't have to shout, "Okay, we're gonna have to reset this, everybody," or "I'm gonna have to wait for the
Yeah.
sun," or you know. And those things are things that obviously filmmakers have to contend with all the time.
Yeah, and is there a point, that you think this shot isn't right? If you're right, you go, this paragraph, I'm just going to cut it.
Yeah,
It's just going to go. But in the
yeah.
middle of production and millions of dollars and all those kind of things at work and all these many people at your kind of behest, that you think, God, I've made a mistake. This isn't a good scene. This isn't a good way of doing this scene. And how do you deal with that? It's
Well,
funny when you do documentaries, you realize that you are, you know, I think Walter Murch talked about this. He says, in the end, you can only work with what you've got, and you get to the point where you've done your interviews and you've started to put it together, and you kind of think, oh, I wish I'd asked him that, or I wish I'd pushed back on that, or further gone into that. Why didn't? Because, the circumstances of interviews is you've only got so much time and you've got all these questions to get through and you're nervous and all those kind of factors. Whereas, so in the end, you have to do what Walter Murch says. You just got to deal with what you've got
mm,
and that's an interesting art then. It becomes much more about how you put juxtapose things and how you use clips and but it's also a frustration. I tell you, one of the hardest things with documentary I've learned is to change subject. On
mm.
page you can just put a new paragraph or you line break or you start a new chapter. It's really simple to change subject. And now we're going to talk about this. Documentaries, no one stops really and goes, no, now I think we should talk about this bit of the subject. And, they don't, no one does that for you. So you kind of have to do it with sort of music, or you have to do it with a pause, or you have to, it's a strangely,
You sort of transition into it, segue into it
yes,
or something.
so it's so hard to do. So I've gained a great deal of respect for the geniuses of this world, and their ability to do all these things. But yeah, I'm just kind of coming back to that point of I'm fascinated by two things when I go, in terms of why I even write about film. I'm fascinated by how they actually do it, how this art is expressed, how you tell this story, and the reasons you tell it the way you do. And a lot of that can be subconscious and influential, all the things that come in to play in it. And I'm really fascinated by the interaction of the viewer and the subject. What are we getting out of it? Why do we watch? What is it like to watch a Scorsese film?
Mm.
That's as important to me as what is it like to make a Scorsese film. That I want to try and that's kind of why one of the reasons why maybe I do so many different directors. I just like to ask that question: is that why? What is it like to watch Tarantino? What is it like to watch the Coens? And what is that relationship we have? That's unique to us in terms of how we watch films, and that's obviously very connected to all those other things, what Scorsese wants us to have and what story he's telling. But it's an extraordinary art form in that sense of it's the closest storytelling ever gets to life, but it isn't life. It's different. It's a different thing. It's a different place. So I'm very interested in what goes on and
And
try and
and
translate that.
and there's no sticking it down either. It's moving so that
Mhm.
even as we look at Scorsese now, his reputation is changing
Yeah,
so significantly to what he was when we were watching these films in the 80s and for the first time. And he was kind of, a 70s survivor who
yeah,
there was a big question mark over his reputation every time he released a film. Speaking of which, this is a perfect segue into
yeah.
the film I've chosen to talk
Okay,
about,
let's do it.
which
Yeah,
is The Color of Money.
yeah,
Now, this film is often, I feel, forgotten or not spoken about as much as Scorsese's other films, slightly because of a sense of embarrassment that it's a studio film and a star vehicle specifically to make Tom Cruise have. I mean, Tom Cruise throughout this period was having a series of films in which he would sort of be matched with an older legend of
Yeah,
Hollywood. So he would be Rain Man, he would be with Dustin Hoffman, and Color of Money, he would be with Paul Newman, and later on, Few Good Men, he would go toe to toe with Jack Nicholson. So there's an element in which Scorsese feels like, on the surface, this is a journeyman job that he's just doing. However, reading your book, you realize quite quickly that this isn't actually the case, that he's bringing in a New York novelist, Richard Price, to do the screenplay, which has nothing to do with the Walter Tevis novel. The Walter Tevis has written the sequel to his original book, The Hustler,
yeah.
which was obviously made as a film by who was the director? Robert Rosen, was it?
Rob Rossen, yeah,
Rossen, sorry.
yeah,
In the 60s, black and white film with Jackie Gleason and Paul Newman. And it's this this film is as a sequel as well. That's another thing.
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
sequel to a film that Scorsese hasn't made, and it's so it's got all the 80s negative things, star vehicle, a sequel, a cash grab, totally into the studio, totally, this is not the independent, this is the opposite of After Hours in a sense. This is you
yeah,
know, and yet to me, I just find this one of the most enjoyable, entertaining, uh, Scorsese movies, and I feel that it's absolutely full of Scorsese. I feel that
yeah, yeah,
the dynamism of the pool is in a way he finds a visual metaphor for what he does best, and he's unleashed. He can move, he can
yeah,
follow the balls into the pockets, and he can see the chalk where the impact of the cue. And even more so, he can indulge in this amazing street poetry that Richard Price writes for him. I have lines of this film that I could act in this film. I've got so many lines. You want what? You won $50? I go into a shoe shop with $50. I come out with one shoe. That sort of stuff. And Paul Newman is just so good, and I
yeah,
totally
yeah,
abhor the idea that he won the Oscar as some sort of career best award, some sort of consolation prize for not having won it earlier. This performance is amazing and utterly Oscar worthy, and is one of his best performances. I mean, I would put this beside The Verdict. The Verdict
yeah, yeah,
gets plaudits for perfectly reasonably, but I think the reason people will look at The Verdict with more seriousness is just because it's more depressing. So people will
yeah,
look at, the arty critics such as ourselves have a prejudice towards, in favor of, depressing material. So if we're having a good time watching something, it's no, it can't be good. We can't enjoy it. We can't enjoy it and it be good at the same time. Um, and I really love this film. It's got such a sense of place. The pool
yeah,
halls.
yeah,
Forrest Whitaker turns up as in a brilliant cameo and utterly steals the scene, which is so meta because he's stealing. He's stealing. He's a hustler, so he's stealing the
yeah,
scene and he's stealing the film and he's stealing the money. Um, and it's just full of everything that I remember. I would rent this. I saw it at the cinema. I would rent this from the video
yeah,
shop, and it would be like a film. I think it was this, The Hitcher, Angel Heart. Those were like, if I went down to the video shop and they had nothing new that looked interesting, it would be one of those three or four films that I would be picking up, taking back, and watching again.
yeah, absolutely. But also, I think it says something very significant about Scorsese in that, you know, people think of him as a kind of an anti-Hollywood guy, an anti-studio guy. He's made films with the studios, but always in great turmoil and resistance. But the truth is, he adores Hollywood. the concept of Hollywood, the history of Hollywood. I mean, there's probably no one alive in America who knows more about the history of Hollywood than Scorsese. And I think what this offered to him was a chance to sort of dabble in old Hollywood, without having a time machine. Because you're making a sequel to a 1950s movie, it was in black and white that he knew extremely well. So it's not a sequel in any kind of modern terms. It's a ridiculous sequel in a sense. You're working with Paul Newman at a time when he has become more of a kind of an icon of former years. He wasn't a current actor in the sense, if you looked at him, you went, look, it's great. He's still going strong, but he's long past his beautiful early, iconic days. But that to Scorsese is a great invitation to sort of dabble in something historical. And as you say, it's got this wonderful vernacular. It's got a kind of thing that Scorsese always hones in on, a kind of working class spirit. That this is a sports movie in a sense, but no great sort of glamorous sports movie way. There are no crowds, there are no kind of big uplifting scenes. There's just this sense of the hustle, and the hustle becomes the metaphor for life. Obviously, hustle is something Scorsese understood in relation to studios, and there is, I think, a chance to work with actors, but not actors in the sense of this is his stock company. This is the De Niro, Keitel routine. These are totally different guys for Scorsese. So he gets to sort of do the things he likes, but in a different way, with a different chemistry with people. And I think Cruise is terrific in it. And I think what is often forgotten about Cruise, because he now just wants to hang off airplanes and things and do these kind of long-winded things. And I enjoy them much as the next man. But what is forgotten about Cruise is there was a great hunger in him in the early years to be more than just a superstar, to be more than just sort of Jerry Bruckheimer's guy, to be to work with people like Scorsese and Oliver Stone and Barry Levinson and all the people he did work with to prove what he could do. But I imagine for Cruise, the chance to have a kind of mentor relationship with Newman, both on and off the camera, was extraordinary. Yet, and this is true of Rain Man as well, I think, Cruise isn't playing second fiddle. He isn't the kind of like the support guy there to make it's all about Newman, it's all about Hoffman. In fact, I would argue that Cruise's is the performance of Rain Man. He is the man who turns the narrative, who keeps
Oh
the engine
yeah,
of that film
yeah.
going.
It's not. This isn't
While,
Scent of a
yeah,
Woman, where Al Pacino
yeah.
has a young American actor next to him whose name totally escapes me because,
It's Chris O'Donnell,
of
which says a
course,
lot
it
about
is.
Chris
Yeah,
O'Donnell.
yeah.
It's impossible to remember. Poor old Chris O'Donnell. But yeah, uh, and I think you get a real sense of the kind of the old star and the new star. There's lovely dynamics which are all, and I kind of wrote about it, and I think this is true that when you say Color of Money, the first thing you think of is not Scorsese. You think of Newman, you think of Cruise and Paul, and then you go, oh God, yes, it was Scorsese. And I think that's the only Scorsese film where that's the case, where even the kind of the magnificent gangster films he's made, he's still the first name that springs to mind. But with Color of Money, it isn't. And it's a pleasure when you go, oh God, yes, we get Scorsese as well, don't we? What a joy that is.
Absolutely. And I think it's possibly because as well that even Goodfellas and Casino and all those gangster movies that he does, although they're often counterpointed, as Francis Ford Coppola does the opera of gangsterism, and Scorsese does the punk and the rock and roll of gangsterism. Um, Color of Money is even more small scale than that. It's more the world of sort of George V. Higgins or something. A real
Yeah.
the lower echelons. Someone maybe Elmore Leonard might a grittier version of Elmore Leonard might be working on something like this, because these are guys who really will never sort of touch on organized crime more than being potentially people who have to make the odd payout,
Yeah.
and I totally agree with you about Tom Cruise. It was a period in his career where he recognized that obnoxiousness was a tool in his toolkit that, as an honest actor, he could deliver in a performance and make a part of a character. And as his career went on, he was less and less. I don't know when we last saw it. We probably saw a bit of it in War of the Worlds, in that he's an imperfect parent who is forced by crisis to sort of grow up a bit and not be such an arsehole. Um, a character who nevertheless will be sort of overpowered by the film itself in many ways and the spectacle that it represents. And yeah, I mean, I think in the recent Mission Impossibles, I saw the last one in Cannes, and I was watching it, and I was just kind of so bored by it. It has these wonderful spectacles and great stunts, but I found myself sort of watching and thinking, that old maxim, and Christopher McQuarrie is this great screenwriter, but there's this old screenwriter maxim, don't tell, show.
The secret is out. With millions of younger-looking customers across the country, Plexiderm is one of the most highly sought-after products on the market. It visibly shrinks under-eye bags and smooths out crow's feet in minutes, and the effects last up to 10 hours. Influencers love it, magazines feature it, and people just can't get enough of it. As a matter of fact, Elle Magazine gave it an Editor's Choice Award as Best Instant Wrinkle Filler for 2025. In as little as 10 minutes, Plexiderm reduces the appearance of fine lines, wrinkles, and those dreaded under-eye bags. So yes, you can look years younger in minutes, and the effects last for hours. No surgery, no gimmicks, just results. The best news, you can try Plexiderm for only $14.95. Plus, get free shipping. Don't wait. Order Plexiderm today. Visit plexiderm.com/special. That's plexiderm.com/special. Paid for by Sheer Science.
Nobody does selling better than Shopify. Shopify is the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret with Shop Pay that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts go abandoned and way more sales going through. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. On the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout that Skims uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period for 3 months at shopify.com/Westwood1, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/Westwood1 to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/Westwood1.
Show not tell. And he'd seem to forget that everything was sort of, we will show you eventually, but first we will tell you over and over and over again. And yeah, it really detracted from the film. Let's go on to the next film that you've got.
Yeah. Yes. If there's a film that's the opposite of Mission Impossible, then it is The Irishman. Yeah, the Irishman, obviously, one thing to sort of frame this with is that The Irishman was an incredibly expensive film. I think $160 million or whatever it costs, and just an extraordinarily large budget that seemed to be, where Scorsese's ambitions lay. In late career, he's doing epics. He's doing long form. He's sort of moved into a different mode that's very expensive. And, in a bigger sense, it's a little bit of a tragedy now that the likes of Scorsese can only get the money to do these things from somewhere like Netflix. Not that it compromised his film in any way, but it sort of compromises our view of the film, in that there's something about Netflix films, no matter how good or bad, they get easily forgotten. They're too easily accessed, and there's kind of a sense that they get a little lost. So in a sense, to me, The Irishman was a film I needed to reclaim from the kind of the bottom of the Netflix drawer and say, hold on, this is Scorsese, and it's an extraordinary film about a director sort of looking at his whole career, an old director, 79 when he made it. And, sort of coming to terms with, the dying of the light. Not that he's dying, but it's a film about the dying of the light. And again, that profound relationship between Scorsese's life and his subject matter. He'd said after Casino there was nothing left to do on gangsters. He'd said his piece, but I think there was always this kind of lurking potential of like, well, what happens if I did go back? What would I do? What story was left to tell? And of course, De Niro, who is so often the catalyst in actually, De Niro gets Taxi Driver made, De Niro gets Raging Bull made. He's often the catalyst who actually gets Scorsese, in action. And that was the case with The Irishman in this book. I hear you paint houses, about Frank Sheeran, who was a real life person and who was basically a very, it's sort of a rise within the mafia story, but he never rises that high. He rises to a kind of middle manager hitman role. He's not one of the big guys, and it's his life story. And I sort of frame this in a kind of a slightly ironic way, that it's an ordinary guy story, despite the fact he's a killer for the mob. It's an ordinary guy at the very end of his life. And there's a great, beautiful kind of Scorsese in joke that he has this tracking shot akin to the copper, but he's going into a hospital, he's run through a hospital.
A rest home.
A rest home. And it ends up, and you've just got this old De Niro with makeup, and about to contemplate his life. And I think out of that springs an extraordinary film about American history, about Scorsese's relationship with the mob, about aging, about the way Scorsese has made films and how you can reapply that to a different era of your life, about this joyous gamesmanship of finally putting Al Pacino in one of his films, that great, when will it happen? The one missing, great Italian-American performer is Pacino, and when will it come? And the kind of fantastic idea of, when you go watch The Irishman, of course you think a little bit about heat, and the mythic qualities that Michael Mann put in putting these two guys together for 10 minutes. Scorsese does, 3 hours plus of them together and has them in pajamas like Morecambe and Wise, and the vague air of kind of vaudeville that he threads into the film as well. That there's just a tiny bit that the film is sending itself up a little bit, that Scorsese is sending himself up a little bit. You thought I wasn't going to make another gangster movie. You were wrong. Oh, look at this. It's 3.5 hours. And especially the second viewing, I do implore people, if you've seen it once and you think, yeah, that was a bit hard work, it wasn't what I wanted from it, the second viewing just brings it to life. It was described, I think, by the New York Times as the Dostoevsky novel of Scorsese films. And that's what it is. It's a novel. It's a great sort of saga told from the point of view of this ordinary man who became a hitman, but it's all about death. It's all about facing death, the end of an era in America. It's this great one parallel between what's going on in Sheeran's life and this kind of Oliver Stone style secret history. It's all, because obviously the story of Hoffa, who Pacino plays, is all tied up with that anyway. What happened to him? How and why and where did he disappear to? Are all parts of the great American mythology.
And it's very simple in the film as well. So we shot him in the back of the head.
Back of the head and dispose of the body. Which again is a contested, although it's taken as fact in the film, is contested, of course, by the many conspiracy theorists out there. But there's this kind of wonderful sort of side parallel about the fact they admit to killing Kennedy at one point, and they kind of, all these things go on. And there's this beautiful portrayal of all the kind of hierarchies within the mob family, and they're played by Harvey Keitel and Joe Pesci. This great sense of the gangs back together for one last
even
hurrah.
Talking about the parody aspect that you were mentioning, you have Joe Pesci, but he's like the Zen heart of the movie. He's like this totally calm character who's like just
benign, lethal but benign. And this is beautiful, again, Scorsese's filmmaking. You cannot ever take it for granted. If you watch that film again, watch how slowly the cars go. all the cars go at the pace of a hearse. You know, there's no car chases. There's none of the kind of wired energy of Goodfellas and Casino. This is all a film that's going to like, it's going to take its damn time, you know. And I thought, this is great. This is how an old man tells a story. You know, he rambles, he goes off at tangents. But at the heart of it is a sort of terrifying thing. It's a question that Scorsese asks, did he have a soul? The central question asks is, how could a man who essentially comes to love the man he's looking after, the man he's bodyguard for, Hoffa, Al Pacino's Hoffa, essentially it's like a Scorsesean marriage, their relationship in the film. How could he kill him? How could he be the hitman that killed him and not show any remorse for this? And Scorsese wants to ask, can you love someone and kill them? Is the mob code so strong, so programmed into him that he's like a Terminator? You know, he can't drift off his programming, even though he's come to love this guy. Or does he have a soul at all? And that is a kind of chilling kind of way of looking at humanity. And you get those great existential elements that Scorsese always imbues. It's like, what are we about? What makes us human? You know, do we have guilt? You know, what part does God play in all of this?
I was going to bring that up. I mean, the thing that I found, and I think this is what justifies its length much more than any other of those long films which people criticize for length, is the fact that time becomes the big killer in the end. It's time that is erasing everything. And so that last half hour of the movie in which you see him essentially aging is almost like he is nothing compared to time. You know, he might be a killer, but time has killed everybody. You know, he's just killed a few people.
And there's a great motif in the film where with each of the characters we get those sort of textual moments, little graphics that come up on screen telling us how they've died. You know,
yes.
And of course that, you know, anyone who's spent time with old people, and I probably count myself as getting a bit older now, but they often go, whatever happened to that? Oh, he died a few years ago, didn't he? It's sort of that way of kind of charting your life with the kind of the death of people. And it's all about how they died. Some, of course, die young because they're hit in the mob fashion. But Sheeran is just, you know, time is going to catch up with him. You know, it's inescapable. You know, they're the scenes of the very old men, and they're really ancient. And they're just weak husks of these great sort of mob villains. And that's kind of it's a tragedy in a sense. And Scorsese, the kind of great humanizing element to it is that it comes to us all in the end.
It reminds me a little bit as well of what Kurt Vonnegut said, where he was talking about people dying in his life. And he's in his final novel, Timequake, he said, you know, all the people I wanted to impress are dead. And there's that idea, sort of the negative version of that. All the people who knew why I should be hated are dead. And so does that mean I'm forgiven? You know, does that mean there's no one here even knows even remembers Jimmy Hoffa? You know, it's become like, I remember Jimmy Hoffa being, you know, there was a David Mamet film directed by Danny DeVito with Jack Nicholson in the 1980s, quite an underrated movie. So it was it was still in the conversation even then. But when The Irishman came out, I doubt many people so it certainly wasn't as present as it would have been 10, 15, even 20 years ago. The other film that it reminds me of a lot is a little known film called The Iceman, starring Michael Shannon, which is also about a sort of mid-level trigger man. Again, a true story, and just primarily because anything with Michael Shannon front and center is well worth watching. So if you it covers similar territory in a much more succinct manner, and has this burning sort of portrayal by Shannon, terrifying portrayal by Shannon right at the center, and that's really good. I'll move on now to the second film that I've chosen, the last film, although we could also sort of touch on a couple of others, sort of honorable mentions if you like. But I wanted to talk about a film that I saw in a sort of self-made double bill in that I had the whole day free and I was in Bradford and I was kicking around and I went to the cinema, a beautiful cinema in Bradford with the museum nearby, and I made myself a double bill. And the first film I saw was The Big Lebowski, and the second film I saw was Kundun. Um,
Okay, it's not one I would have predicted.
no,
It's not a double bill. They
but
spring straight to mind.
but weirdly, the mandala really held the room together. I
There's a
mean,
kind of Zen connection, isn't there? There's a
precisely,
kind
precisely.
yeah.
You would be surprised. I walked out of the cinema having watched those two films. I can't even remember which order I watched them in, feeling very much like I had refreshed myself spiritually, and I've been dipped in a sort of Eastern river of. No, I love this movie. I really loved it when I first watched it. I disagree with the New York Times David Denby sort of quotation that you have in your book where it says it's a very beautiful but boring film. I don't think it's boring at all. I find it really dramatic. I think Scorsese, the flip side of his sort of cocaine fueled, agitated whip pans and all the rest of it, is him knowing that there is a ozu in him as well that can sometimes be he can sometimes take over and use. This is a film in which Roger Deakins is the cinematographer, Melissa Matheson,
Yeah.
the then wife of the then wife of Harrison Ford. In fact, there's a story of how Scorsese got to read the script was essentially Harrison Ford phoning him up and reading it down the phone to him. So that's like any young script writers out there.
I used to work in the office, but Marty, we've got Harrison Ford on the phone for you. Harrison Ford?
Yeah. Exterior, the desert. Tibet. Um, two monks crouch over a temple floor. I just think, even that opening sequence in which they're creating that mandala, there is just this is just such prepares you for such a change of pace and an idea of, and this is a film which is part of a sequence of films that, retrospectively we look at Silence, Last Temptation of Christ and Kundun as his sort of religious trilogy, religious. Spiritual trilogy. And
Yeah.
of the three, I would argue that Kundun is the most successful and coherent. I think I really do have a lot of time for Last Temptation of Christ. Silence is pending a rewatch because I watched it in uh, entirely the wrong way. Essentially, I read the book from cover to cover in the afternoon and went to see it that evening, and I don't think that
Right.
does it any favors. I don't think that would do any film of any book any favors. I think it's too,
No, you
you
carry
know,
the book in your head too much at that
yeah,
point. Yeah, you decided what it's like, and
yeah,
yeah,
precisely,
get it.
precisely. But I found Kundun. It looks beautiful. It's got this beautiful score by Philip Glass. I think it's really moving, and it's really you talk about it really interestingly because, of course, Melissa Matheson had also written E.T. the Extraterrestrial for Spielberg, and in your book you mention how it sort of looks at the political machinations around the Dalai Lama, who Kundun is the Tibetan name for the sort of the Godhead as they believe.
Yeah,
Um, and you see it as a Spielbergian sort of children's eye view of his growth and him becoming a young man and becoming and having to deal with Chairman Mao, and his understanding of
yeah,
Mao is his understanding of his shoes. He notices something about his shoes and he thinks, okay, I think I know who this guy is. He's sort of he claims to be this man of the people, but look at his shiny shoes. And I just found this, yeah, I don't know, it transported me. It transported me without being um, guilty of the crime of Orientalism. I felt that it was sort of
yeah.
deeply intent on portraying things without in any way patronizing them. If somebody had said to me, if I had gone in with blind, I wouldn't necessarily have known it was Martin Scorsese. It could have, I could have easily been by someone else. And I just find it a profoundly moving film, a film that I go back and watch every now and again, and it really it speaks to that other side of his nature, which isn't really a dichotomy because I think it's entwined. I think you do find it in. I
Yes.
think his gangster films are religious, and his religious films are gangster films.
Oh yeah.
I mean,
I mean,
Harvey
you can
Keitel
go.
in Last
Yeah.
Temptation of Christ, no more
Yeah.
crosses. He's the local mobster.
Completely. And if you do the basic, the Scorsese basic biographies, he could have been an altar boy. He was an altar boy, trained to be a priest, didn't know what his place in the world was, found film, or film found him. And that was his religion, but without ever shaking the Catholicism. And if you look at all three of the trilogy of what is known as the religious films, they're all about the clash between holiness, if you want, or a holy vision, and a secular force. Or what, I know the Romans did have their gods, but they're seen as a secular force, whereas Mao clearly is an anti-religious force. And in silence, it's the kind of the samurai, Japanese authorities, which again are anti the Catholicism. So there's this sort of clash in all of those films, which speaks to somehow the clash inside of Scorsese. When he's asked, do you believe in God? He always sort of strikes his kind of slightly evasive, agnostic tone of, I don't really know. I have the guilt and I have the Catholicism inside me, but he doesn't really commit either way. But I think each of those films is an exploration of the kind of doubts within himself and the conflict within himself between the secular side that his art brings and the kind of the thing that I suppose many people face is there something more to this? The need for religion and having kind of been grown up with religion. Although what's interesting about Scorsese's story is it didn't come through his parents. It wasn't, obviously it was around and he was a Catholic, but he took himself to church. It was something he kind of needed. And I wonder whether that's tied up with the fact, he was incredibly asthmatic as a child, and to the point where it was, he would have contemplated not getting older. He would have contemplated not making it because he was that sickly that he needed a religion to kind of get him through. So I do find those films sort of fantastically tied up with who he is, because he's applying all his filmmaking talent and art to the question of religion and the power of religion, and to sort of sort that out in his own head. And of course, there is no conclusion. None of the films quite, come to any definitive argument for the spiritual side. You can argue watching Kundun that the Dalai Lama is messing it up and his people are dying on his behalf, and he's just this kind of figurehead. And you think, well, why should they all be sacrificed? And so there's doubt in it. And the same is true of silence, especially. All these people are dying, and they're kind of because they bought into this idea of religion, and they're getting drowned and crucified in those sort of striking scenes. So they're very Scorsese, I suppose is my point, these religious films, especially Kundun. But I really take your point on it's so beautiful. What's sort of, not that his other films are full of beauty, but in a kind of very narratively driven, the energy of what they portray. Yet in Kundun, there's a contemplative side to it where he's right, I'm just going to hold on to a scene for far longer than Thelma Schoonmaker would normally let me. Should be going cut into this. And he's going, I'm just going to hold on to this and let the image be something. And, because he's a man who reveres Ozu, and he reveres those great, slow-paced Italian neo-realists, So I imagine it's just, it must have been a joy to sort of be more the artist maybe than the kind of New York gangster storyteller.
And it's his least verbal film. These people are not chattering away. They're as you say again. You mention it in the book, and it's a really. It's really interesting that he hears whispers around him rather than there being scenes where people are arguing the point. You get it, and you get it via dreams and visions as much as anything else. So a spectacular overhead shot that sort of comes out to reveal massacred people surrounding him, and that's how he conveys the death, it's not by you seeing it realistically shown, but you see it almost as an infernal mandala, a mandala in
Yeah.
which all the bodies and the blood are just grains of sand ready to be blown away. And that's that also links to me the although this it might seem tenuous to some people, but the religious films are they not about like what happens after we die? I mean, Catholicism is a teleological religion. It's about the end justifying the means, or the end bringing meaning to life. And his gangster movies are full of people ending very suddenly.
Yeah.
Samuel L. Jackson in Goodfellas gets shot in the back of the head while putting his pants on. And there's something, when people get shot and killed, they don't tend to sort of. He doesn't do Jimmy Cagney sort of crawling up the steps of the church. Is this the end for Johnny Boy?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's they get popped in the head and they fall over like they're already dead before they hit the ground.
And
The
all those
Irishman.
those gangster films, especially Goodfellas, he says it's about the lifestyle. It's about the living in the now, in the moment. It's the risk is worth it. Whatever the statistics were, your chances of survival were pretty thin, ultimately. But the lifestyle is worth it. The power is worth it. So it's very much for what's this side of the grave, the gangster film. It's all for the here and now.
Yeah,
Whereas
absolutely.
religious films are, what's over that mountain pass, what's in the next, and is it worth it, to go through the excruciating agonies of life that they all portray to get to something better.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, let's talk a little bit about honorable mentions, and we can wrap this yeah, I love talking about Scorsese, so we've got to be careful this doesn't stretch to 4 hours. This
I
doesn't
know.
let's make it
I
let's
think it's
make it Color of Money rather than The
the
Irishman.
Irishman. Yeah.
Or Killers of
Two
the
old
Flower
men
Moon.
slowly reminiscing.
Yeah. Forgetting who they're talking about by the end. Who would you? Well, let me start. I watched The Aviator last night in preparation
Yeah.
to this interview as well, and the reason I specifically chose The Aviator is it's one of the films, a little bit like Silence, which I wasn't as enamored of when I first saw it. I felt it was a bit of a star vehicle. I felt that it softened the image of Howard Hughes, who, we watch him sympathetic to his growing problems with mental illness rather than sort of his much more predatory, rapey,
Yeah.
racist, white supremacist ideas. That seemed to be sort of a little bit under the carpet. Those criticisms are still valid and they're still there, but I did enjoy this time just the verve of the film and the look of the film. It looked
Yes.
extraordinary, and he has this thing of making. There's a moment where Kate Blanchett as Katharine Hepburn plays golf with
Yeah.
Howard
Yeah.
Hughes, Leonardo
Those sort of
DiCaprio, of course.
turquoise greens. Yeah.
Absolutely
Yeah.
wonderful. It's just like, and I was thinking halfway through the film, why am I seeing it like this? Why is it? And of course, the immediate answer that hadn't occurred to me before is because he's making us look at the world differently, the way Howard Hughes is looking at the world differently, and so he's showing us that everything from his point of view is off,
Yeah.
and no one else is noticing it, and he's not noticing it because this is how he's always seen it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's a glorious chance to sort of wallow in his adoration of golden era Hollywood and yet still make a Scorsese film. This is the trick of Scorsese, it always seems to me, is that whatever you throw at him, he'll make a Scorsese film out of it. He'll find the Scorseseness. So here you have a classic golden era Hollywood story, but about mental illness, about, almost like a taxi driver like figure. Yet he's at the pinnacle of a studio and he's a billionaire and he's this great aviator. And he's handsome. Everything about him is the opposite of maybe Travis Bickle. Yet he has a sort of decline that matches it. I am with you in the sense that I do wonder if those things don't quite fit together as well as they have in other films, that he isn't wholly sure of which film he's making. There are
Mm,
wonderful. I love the scenes at the kind of Senate hearings at the end with Alan Alda, who's just and I love Scorsese supporting performances. They just John C. Riley, all the people.
superb.
this wonderful performance. Oh God, they're in it. It's just brilliant, and of course, Kate Blanchett is peerless, as Hepburn. So I kind of, and Baldwin, Baldwin is so good in that film, and he's a great unsung Scorsese actor, Baldwin. But yeah, I do take your point that I watched it probably about 3 times now, and
Hmm.
I always have that niggling doubt about it that it's not quite gelled.
I think he wants to make an old-fashioned good guy. He wants to make almost like a Gary Cooper
Yeah,
film, where a Frank Capra film, where it's the little guy, it's a little
yeah,
guy against the big guys, and the problem structurally is his little guy is the richest man in America.
yeah,
It's like, so even when it comes to like government oversight,
yeah.
well, why it's un-American not allowing me to do whatever I want with my my millions and millions of dollars. And I can imagine Elon Musk feeling this film is absolutely bang
Yeah.
on the money. It has a certain political naivety, shall we say, and that is something I find. Yeah, I think that's something that I think he's played with the studio system so much,
Yeah.
including getting films made with Weinstein and all the rest of it, that there is an element of Scorsese of like he'll go along to get along, and I think he's a bit tortured by that as well.
Yeah.
But I remember him. I remember there was a cutaway when Michael Moore got the Oscar for Fahrenheit 9/11, and he made a speech and he said, against the Bush government, and it sort of cut away to several people in the audience applauding, and Scorsese was kind of half applauding but looking
Yeah.
really worried about it. It was yeah, and you could tell he probably totally agreed with Michael Moore, but he also didn't want to put his eggs in that basket.
He's not he is a political filmmaker because he makes personal films. He makes films about America,
Sure.
and obviously but I wouldn't say he was sort of a sort of consciously political filmmaker.
Right.
I don't think he has an agenda beyond what he wants to portray, and from that maybe you can draw out a sort of political meaning. But it strikes me that he doesn't. I mean, he's a humanist, so I think that brings politics with it, and a sort of side to him. But he doesn't make message films in that sense, because he doesn't like conclusions. He doesn't like underlining and saying, "Well, this is what it all means." I mean, I love Wolf of Wall Street because it's a wonderfully joyously funny film, but also he doesn't judge them because he's saying to the audience, "Well, you do the judging."
Yeah.
I'm just showing you. This is America. This is what gangsters have become. You do the judging. And I thought, "God, that's clever," because we sit there going, "I'm really enjoying this, but should I
Should I
should
be?
I be
Yes.
appalled?" But I'm not appalled, and I'm rather worried about this. And I love that again, how you watch the film and he's engaging with that, going, "Well, it's up to you. You're a grown up. You deal with it."
It was funny how Wolf of Wall Street sort of received at the time, and then slightly, well, not even slightly, quite significantly after a few years with Me Too and all the rest of it, people were like, "How did this film even get, the approval that it got when
Yeah,
it came out?" And I was thinking, well, there's this cliche of you should never punch down with comedy, and like all modal verbs, it often stands with its own as its own
yeah,
contradiction. You should never, but you always do.
yeah,
And abusing people and bullying people and treating people like shit is frequently entertaining. It's
yeah,
frequently funny, and to just deny it blanketly is there's there's a strain of puritanism about that, and moralism, which just doesn't accept a certain element of human nature, and not one that I revel in or want to celebrate necessarily, but one that
yeah.
nonetheless exists. If we don't acknowledge it, what are we going to do?
And it's a great sort of exercise in, again, human sort of engagement and what do we find funny?
Mm, mm.
And you can sort of start dressing things up and playing around with things, but these are kind of puerile things. And he knows they're puerile and vulgar and horrible in so many ways, how they treat women. And there's a couple of moments, aren't there? There's the woman who cuts her hair off as a
Yeah,
dare.
because
And
she wants the money for a boob
yeah,
job as
for a
well.
boob
So
job. And Scorsese cuts back to her. He does something he doesn't do much anywhere else in the film. He doesn't stop to account. Apart from there's this moment, he cuts back to, and the actress is terrific. She just does a look as her hair in her sort of lap. And it's a bit like, what the fuck's just happened? You know, what have I just done? How has this occurred? And it's, you know, just, and you as a watcher go, oh God, this is awful. But then it just gallops on. That you're not given enough time. And again, those are the little tests. The guy on the other end of the phone when he's conning, you know, at the beginning, and you're carried along with the excitement. But on the whole, Scorsese doesn't take a judgment in it, and I find that very fascinating. And I think it's the quality of the film. And it's very funny, but yes, you're meant to be uncomfortable. You are.
Was that your honourable mention, or was?
Well, I hadn't planned to be, but clearly it's not true.
Have you got another one that you want?
The other one I want, yeah. Again, it's about, you know, when you kind of come to write the books, and it's the ones that sort of surprise you when you go back to them. So I knew what I was going to expect with a lot of films I love a lot, but I'd forgotten how entertaining The Departed is. And I know there's a lot of arguments. One shouldn't have won the Oscar. It's Scorsese sort of doing the Hollywood thing, like he's always criticised. He's always thinking the selling out of Martin Scorsese, and you watch every one of his films, and he's never sold out. Cape Fear, no, it's a terrific film. You know, there just isn't a case of that, and neither is the case of The Departed. And it's just, I mean, it's mad. It's like a mad farce, you know, but it's told with this kind of great violence and with a kind of gangster idiom around it. But it's so well constructed, and it's so giddy with its own kind of cross-cutting. I mean, there's a story, I put it in the book, that, I mean, he wrestled with that film. He's a tormented Scorsese, The Departed. And Thelma sort of sat him down in the kind of screening room and said, here's our assembly. And he came out and went, we're starting again. Everything, you know, from you know, every bit of footage was thrown out, and they started again with a new cut, because it was all about timing and comic rhythms. And it's bonkers. I mean, it's like some kind of Jacobean drama at the end, because everybody starts dying. People getting dropped off roofs, and they're getting shot and killed, to the point where it is ridiculous. But then you think, he knows it's ridiculous. The whole film is ridiculous. And that's what's fun about it, you know. It's one of his best comedies. Again, it's a bit akin to Wolf of Wall Street. There is this kind of, and again, back to After Hours, this sort of sort of a strain of hysterical comedy that he unleashes every now and then. I always think to great effect that, you know, it's almost self-parody, The Departed. But I tell you, you know, I was watching The Fugitive last night. I tell you the reason why I watched Harrison Ford in The Fugitive last night, because I caught the first 5 minutes, and that was that. You know, I was in it.
You're off to the races.
I'm staying up till 1 o'clock. There's no way, you know, I can watch it so many times I like, but it's on now, and I'm going to watch it because it's so entertaining. And The Departed was like that. First few minutes, I'm in it, and it carries you along. And I think it's probably, in the kind of broadest sense, Scorsese's most entertaining film.
I've got to tell you a story about The Fugitive, because I don't know where I picked this up, but it made me laugh so much. I think you'll enjoy it. So there's a guy working on one of the Bonds, and he's working with Pierce Brosnan. It's Pierce Brosnan Bond, and they seem to be getting on well. I'm not sure he's an AD or second AD or something. He's sort of middle level, so he can talk to Pierce Brosnan, but at the same time, if Pierce Brosnan says, I don't want to talk to you, that would also be okay. It wouldn't be totally acceptable. So halfway through the shoot, 2 weeks into the shoot, he was talking to a couple of people, and Brosnan's there, and he says to him, oh, I watched Fugitive last night. And Pierce Brosnan went, I don't care. And the guy goes, oh, okay, all right. And he sort of walks away and says, geez, what did I say? What, you know, I must have upset him somehow. Maybe he's preparing for a big scene of that. He says, so the rest of the shoot, he just stayed away from him. He was just sort of like, you know. And at the end of the shoot, Brosnan came up to him and said, oh, well, I thought we were getting on at the beginning of the shoot. What happened? And he said, well, I was telling you the other day that I saw The Fugitive, and you said, I don't care. He said, I was quoting the film. It's Tommy Lee Jones says, I don't care. It's the most famous line in the film. So there was this cross purposes. I thought that was such a great.
I didn't kill my wife. I don't care.
Yeah. It's the famous, the
Yeah.
red pencil going through the, two speeches that they were supposed to give. Um, no, that's brilliant. One of the one thing finally, to finish our conversation
Yeah.
on Scorsese, there have been a couple of sort of gaps just before people write in and complain. I would say he has had a parallel intertwined career as a director of documentaries.
Yeah.
No Direction Home, I I would say is one of the best
The Last Waltz,
documentaries. Yeah, yeah, well,
fabulous piece of,
yeah, absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. So I think there's his George Harrison documentary
Yeah.
is sensational. I mean, his history of cinema. I think it's a history of Italian cinema he's
And
done.
he's done it, and Journey Through American Cinema as well, which are
Right.
like 4 hours long. And
Yeah.
then once you start watching those, you're there for 4 hours, in his company. Wonderful films.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and even earlier on, Italian American, the Italian, what was the American Boy, the one about Steve Prince?
Yeah, which is really, I mean, what I love about the documentaries is you can see the narrative filmmaker, the fictional filmmaker at work, that he wants the story, he wants the
Mm,
kind of emotional pull that fiction has, and doesn't see the difference. He doesn't see why the rules don't apply to either end. An American Prince, it's almost like a gangster movie itself, although it's a documentary,
absolutely.
really dark and unnerving little piece. It's really good. Seen in a
Yeah,
hot tub as well. Scorsese in a hot tub with him.
that's
To
worth the
warm anyone
price.
who wants to venture down there.
That's the worth the price of YouTube right there. Also, we haven't mentioned Hugo, which when you talked
Yeah,
earlier about sort of the selling out narrative of Scorsese. I think that's one that, again, I just think the idea of Scorsese doing a children's film, and it's brilliant.
yeah.
It's a really great movie. I think I think it wasn't that in 3D as well.
It was in 3D. Again, yeah, I think he's got endless curiosity about
Mm,
film as a whole. And so he's often tempted, I think, by the challenge of things, the excitement of different kind of way of going about things. And in this case, yeah, filming in London, making a film for children, and a film that's a period piece set in a sort of an alternative Paris. That all things fantasy, not his game at all. All these kind of elements. And of course, it also offered him the chance to portray the world of silent film and Méliès, and stop in sort of casino style, do like a documentary within the overall narrative to explain the history of sort of fantasy cinema, which only he could get away with. I mean, if I give my view, I find it a little bit twee.
mm,
Yeah, yeah, just the look and feel of it. But it's still got wonderful things. Ben Kingsley is fabulous in it. And just all the referential stuff that he does, that you think, oh, this is just someone, he's an absolute master, in
yeah,
charge of this.
absolutely. Well, Ian, I think we've done him.
Yeah.
We've done him good. Did you ever meet Scorsese?
I've met him a couple of times. I mean, I'm sure he doesn't remember me.
Mhm.
Yeah, he's a kind of, as an interview, he's exactly what you expect. He's doesn't stop talking, quite hard to kind of shift onto a different subject. If you get him going on one thing, you're going to get a lot on it. So it's not kind of quick, pithy answers, but that's the joy of Scorsese. His
Yeah,
brain whirs at this kind of unnatural speed.
make sure you have your questions. The
The,
best one at the top.
yeah, the three you can probably get into your hour.
Yeah, yeah. I interviewed him last year at Taormina, and it was it was a lot of fun. I managed also to palm off a copy of the Malick biography
Well done.
as I was leaving the room. So, and he was very pleased about that. He was like, "Oh, yes, I've heard about this." So that made me think. He's the sort of person as well who you think would read it. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? That he's
Yeah, I mean,
interested.
he's the great, film addict. He's
Yeah,
got an addictive personality, as we know of his history.
sure.
But the thing he's addicted to more than anything else is film.
Yeah.
And he loves the history of it. He loves the documentation of it. He loves all that. It's a preservation. I know he's very famous for it, but it's about a preservation of a legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant, Ian. Take care.
Thank you. Cheers.